Hi, I'm Mike, and in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about the effectiveness of a design pattern called the factory pattern in your Apex Code implementations. So I'm really lucky to have had a lot of experience over the years working with developers who are a heck of a lot more experienced and a lot smarter than me. And I've learned a few design patterns that make my code a lot more extensible. They apply to Apex development, and so I'd like to share some of those details with you. Today, we're going to be talking about the factory pattern. The factory pattern is a design pattern that I turn to probably more frequently than any other, and it's one that I look at anytime I'm looking at an implementation that needs to be simplified in some way, usually due to some extensive branching logic. Let's go ahead and see how the factory pattern can be used on this controller. So if we take a closer look here, you'll see that I've got a controller, and it's called Nasty Procedural Controller. I'm not very good at coming up with names for my controllers. Sorry about that. And what we want to do is look at this implementation and see what we can do to make it a little bit better, a little bit more streamlined. Because if you look at what we're doing here, what we're doing is we're actually hiring a consultant with this hire method on the controller. And then based on certain aspects of the contact that's referenced here in the argument, we're going to take different action. So this controller is not fully implemented, but if you look at what is implemented, you'll get an idea of what it is that we're trying to accomplish here. But basically, we do have a custom field on the contact called consultant type. And based on the value of consultant type, we're going to do different things. In this case, we look to see that if the consultant is in a certain state, then we take some specific activity. But that's only if the consultant type is HIM. We want to kick off a flow that is specific to HIM consultants, which we're doing right here. And then lastly, we want to update a custom field on the contact. It's a Boolean. We're going to set that to true and then update the contact. However, if the consultant type is different, if it is a lab tech, then there are a different set of rules that we would need to do. So we've got an exception here that's a state-specific exception. And we've got a unique flow that needs to be run. It's different than the last flow. This flow is specific to lab tech documentation for onboarding. And then we've also got a field that's custom on the contact that needs to be set to true, but only in the case of a lab tech. So if you look here, you see that there are other consultant types that we need to implement, and they're all going to have their own unique set of rules. And what's interesting about this is it's already starting to become kind of a lengthy implementation. You can see that as I continue to implement these different consultant types, it's going to even grow greater than it is right now. And the other thing to consider is that, eventually they can come back and say, look, there are different consultant types that we now have to consider in this controller, right? We've expanded our business, there's different types, and they all have their own set of rules. So a controller like this that's implemented the way that I've done it has the potential to actually get pretty long. It could be somewhere in the neighborhood of, 500 to maybe even 1,000 lines of code, depending on how many different consultant types we have to consider and what each of those different sets of rules are. And so this is where the factory pattern comes into place. It's a pattern that allows us to implement a different set of rules based on this consultant type in a way that is a little bit more extensible and a heck of a lot more easy to read. So what I'll just do is I'll start stepping you through what I would do ordinarily in a situation like this, and then we'll go from there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start, and I'm going to start by creating what I call my factory class. So I'll just say, let's give this a name of consultant hire factory, and that's just going to be an Apex class. And I'll just make a few modifications, and I'll cut and paste some code in here that I've already written just to give you an idea of what the skeleton of this class is going to look like. Okay, so if you look at this class, you see that I've got a single method here. It's called getService. It is static, so we don't have to instantiate an instance of the consultant hire factory. We just have the ability to invoke that getService static method. Right now we have it just returning a generic object, but we're going to update that. It's not going to stay that way. But what we're doing here is we're implementing a switch on the contact's consultant type. We want to take specific action based on the value of that consultant type. And there's plenty to implement here. We're only going to implement a single instance of this just to give you an idea of how the design pattern itself actually works. But for right now, this is pretty generic. It's not doing yet what we want it to do, in that we don't want it to return just a generic object, and we certainly don't want the switch cases to return nulls. But there's a little bit of work that we have to do up front, and that's what we're going to do now. I want to start implementing business rules for the HIM consultant type, and to do that, I've created a class called Hire Service HIM. It may not be evident to you what it is that I'm doing here, so let me just go ahead and start working through this, and I'll talk you through what I'm doing as I'm doing it. I'm going to say that this implements the interface that we just created, called Consultant Hireable. And the first thing you'll notice is that my IDE is complaining with this nasty red line. It's saying, hey, you've implemented an interface, but that interface has a single method called hire, and you haven't included that in your class. Well, all right then, let's go ahead and do that. We'll say public void hire. And it doesn't have a return type, it's void, so this actually makes it comply with that contract. We now have Hire Service HIM, which implements Consultant Hireable, which means it does have its one method. But what is it that we're doing with that? Well, let's go back to our factory, and we'll say, given that the consultant type is HIM, then I want to return an instance of my Hire Service HIM. Okay, so I've got that, and you'll see that my IDE is not complaining, which suggests that this is in compliance then with everything that I'm implementing. No exceptions have been uncovered. It looks like from a compiling standpoint, everything looks good. Let's go back and see if we can finish this implementation. Okay, I've returned to the Hire Service HIM class that I just created, and we want to start doing stuff in this hire method, but what is it that we want to do? Well, to refresh your memory on what it is that we're trying to accomplish, let's go ahead and look at the nasty procedural controller once again. And you can see we've got my sort of lengthy, long, lots of branching logic implementation here, and what we want to do is we want to isolate everything that's going on with the HIM consultant type and put that in the class that we are implementing. So there may be some things that we have to change and refactor to get this to work. But let me first just take this code and I'll copy it and paste it over here. We'll take a look at it and see, is there anything that we're missing? And right away we can see that, yeah, there's some things that my IDE is complaining about. There's a contact object that doesn't yet exist. And as a consequence, it's just not able to work with some of this code. So let's make a few modifications to this and see if we can get this working. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a property to this class for the contact object. Now there's got to be a way for me to get a handle on this contact. So what I'll do is I'll create a constructor on the Hire Service HIM class that allows me to pass in a fully qualified contact object. So what I've done here is I've created a constructor that takes an argument of a contact, and it effectively sets that contact as the contact that exists as a member on this class. This isn't going to change, so I'll just go ahead and make this final. Now, when I switch back to my consultant hire factory, I can see now that my IDE is complaining about there being a problem. And that problem is that we've just defined a constructor on Hire Service HIM, but we are not leveraging that constructor here. So we need to include that contact object as an argument, and that should make it happy. Now I've returned to my nasty procedural controller, and I'm going to go ahead and grab some of this code here, which is for the lab tech consultant type. And I'm going to create a new class. I'll step us through that exact same process once again. Okay, now I've created a class called Hire Service Lab Tech, and I am going to make this implement the consultant hireable interface again. And that means it wants to have that method called hire that returns a void, has no arguments, and we know that it's going to want a contact because that's what we encountered in our last class. So we'll just go ahead and do that again. And we know that the constructor is going to need to take that contact and set that private member. So let's implement that. Okay, and now that that's done, let's take that code that we just copied from nasty procedural controller and let's just drop that here. Okay, and with that done, we're going to go over to the consultant hire factory and we're going to say for the lab tech type, let's return hire service lab tech and we'll give it that contact. So if you look at what we're doing, you can probably tell what's going on. We're basically saying, given that we've got a specific consultant type, return an instance of an object that's got a single method that does the work that's necessary for that consultant type. So it does introduce a variety of new classes into your org, but it also makes things a lot easier to read and a lot easier to extend. Let me show you how by refactoring the nasty procedural controller to be a happy controller instead. I've created a new class, it's called Happy Controller, but I have copied and pasted all of the implementation from Nasty Procedural Controller into this class. So this is just to give us sort of a baseline of a baseline look, that is, of what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Really what we want to do is we want to take everything that's in this implementation on this line and below, and we just want to clean it up. We want to make it look better, a little bit easier to read, a little bit easier to know what's going on here. I'm just going to take this and completely eliminate it. And now, given that I've got just this simple implementation of a SQL query that retrieves a contact object, what I want to do is I want to make use of my factory class. So let's do that this way. I want to get an instance of a consultant hireable, and we'll call it hire service. If you recall, consultant hireable is my interface with that single hire method. And I want to get that by calling my consultant hire factory and saying get service. And I'm going to hand it over the contact that we just did a query for. So let's look at what we're doing here. I'm saying consultant hire factory, get service based on this contact object. So let's jump right back into consultant hire factory once again, just to refresh our memories on what's going on here. So if this consultant is an HIM consultant type, then that means that our factory is going to return an instance of the hire service HIM. If it is a lab tech consultant type, then it's going to return an instance of the hire service lab tech. And because either one of those classes have that method that we're looking for, which is called hire, and the hire service has its own set of rules in its hire method, and the hire service lab tech has its own set of rules and its hire method, we have every bit of faith that the class that we're going to get back is going to do what we want it to do. So back on the happy controller, now that we've got the hire service, and we really at this level, we don't know which one we've got here. We just know that the hire service is going to have a hire method, and we want to invoke that hire method. And we trust that the hire method that gets invoked is going to be the one that we want based on the consultant type, because we have defined that here. So to sum up, let's take a look at what we've done. We've introduced this consultant hire factory. By doing so, we've also introduced the consultant hireable interface. We've implemented two classes. One of them is called hire service HIM, and the other is called hire service lab tech, both of which implement the consultant hireable interface, which means they both have that hire method. And with that work done, it enables us to take our nasty procedural controller, which looks like this and has the potential to grow and get a lot bigger, and we've changed it into an implementation that instead looks like this. So if you consider that if you were a developer who's coming into somebody else's implementation to maybe support it or extend it in some way, imagine that you don't have to look at something like this and try to decipher what's going on. Instead, you would have something that's a little easier to understand that looks a bit more like this. Like this, to me, feels a little bit more like a roadmap, a little bit clearer on what's going on. And then each of these implementations, they can get as elaborate or as simple as possible. And because they're encapsulated in their own classes, there's really no crossover or confusion. There's certainly opportunities to make this implementation better. Like we've got these state-specific exceptions. There's probably ways that we could make that better on each of these classes. But this is a really good start. To sum up, I am frequently using the factory pattern to take implementations that look really long and sort of unwieldy like this and transform them into easier to read, much easier to extend implementations that look like this. I'll include a little bit more data in the notes on this video on where you can find more information on design patterns that might be helpful for your implementations. That's the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.